Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters in Christ, I want to talk to you tonight about something that carries more weight than the last 10 years of your life combined. I want to talk to you about tonight. Not yesterday, not next week, but tonight. Because when God marks a moment, everything that came before it starts to make sense. And everything after it begins to shift. You see, sometimes we spend years praying, waiting, crying, wondering if it's ever going to happen for us. But what if I told you that God has a habit of doing in one night what we couldn't make happen in a decade? What if the breakthrough, the healing, the clarity, the open door you've been asking for isn't scheduled for some distant future, but for tonight? This is not just another evening. This is not just another word. This is a divine appointment. And I believe with everything in me that if you're listening to this right now, God has chosen you to hear something that will shift the trajectory of your life. Not gradually, not eventually, but immediately. So lean in, chosen one, because tonight matters more than the last 10 years. One night with God can redeem 10 years of pain. It's a powerful thought, isn't it? That in the blink of an eye, in a single moment, God can do in your life what you've spent years trying to accomplish. It's a truth that runs deep in the Bible. God can turn around your situation faster than you ever imagined, and He doesn't need a decade to do it. What feels like a long and drawn out season of struggle can shift with one divine encounter. It's the kind of shift that transforms everything. That one moment with God can change the course of your destiny. Think about the story of Joseph. For years, he was sold into slavery, falsely accused and thrown into prison. He went through seasons where everything seemed to be against him. He could have easily given up or lost faith in God's promise, but God's plan for Joseph didn't depend on time. In a single night, everything changed. Joseph went from the prison to the palace, from being forgotten to being second in command over all of Egypt. His dreams were fulfilled and his years of suffering were redeemed in a single moment when the king had a dream and Joseph was there to interpret it. Joseph didn't know that his moment was coming. For all he knew, he was still a slave, still locked in prison. But God's timing was perfect. God doesn't work on our timetable. He works on His. And when He decides it's time for a breakthrough, it can happen in a moment, in a night, in an instant. That's what I want you to hear tonight. One night with God can redeem the years that you've lost. What you thought was wasted time is never wasted with God. We also see this in the life of the Israelites. They wandered in the desert for 40 years. 40 years of struggle, disobedience, and waiting. 40 years of hearing about the promised land, but never fully experiencing it. But when the time was right, when God said it was time to move, everything changed. In a single night, the Jordan River parted and the Israelites crossed into their promise. Like 40 years of waiting, and yet it was all redeemed in one powerful moment. The same God who parted the Red Sea for Moses now parted the Jordan River for Joshua. They walked into the land that was promised to them, just as God said they would. One night, one moment with God, and everything that seemed impossible became possible. The desert wasn't wasted. The wandering wasn't wasted. It was all part of God's plan to prepare them for that moment. They had no idea when it was coming, but they trusted that God was in control of their destiny. Now let's bring this into your life. You've been waiting. You've been praying. You've been wondering if it's ever going to happen for you. The years of waiting, of striving, of feeling like you're stuck in a holding pattern, it can be overwhelming. But I want to remind you that God doesn't need time to work in your life. What you've been waiting on for years, God can do in a single night. You may feel like you've wasted time or that your dreams have been delayed, but with God, there's no such thing as wasted time. He redeems it all. Sometimes we think that if we could just wait a little longer or work a little harder, we would finally see the breakthrough we've been longing for. But God works outside the limits of time. You don't have to wait for years for God to move in your life. When the moment is right, He will do more in a night than you could ever accomplish on your own in a lifetime. Think of the story of the prodigal son. He left home, squandered his inheritance, and wasted his years living in sin. But when he hit rock bottom, he decided to return to his father. And in that moment, everything changed. His father didn't wait for him to earn his way back into the family. No, his father ran to him, embraced him, and welcomed him home with open arms. The son had wasted years, but in a single moment, his father redeemed all of that lost time. He was restored to his rightful place in the family. And there was a celebration in his honor. That's how God works. He doesn't hold your mistakes against you. He doesn't count the years you've lost. He's not sitting there waiting for you to make up for all that time you've lost. Instead, He says, "Come home, my child, and I will redeem those lost years. I will restore you in ways you never thought possible." God's timing is perfect and His power is unlimited. We see this in the life of Jesus as well. He performed miracles in an instant. He healed the sick, raised the dead, and delivered the oppressed, all with a word, all in a moment. His power doesn't need years to build. When Jesus spoke, everything shifted. When He moved, lives were changed forever. But what does that mean for you? It means that God can do the same in your life. You might feel like you're in a season of delay, but what if that delay is just God preparing you for the breakthrough? What if He's allowing those years of struggle to shape you, to refine you, so that when the moment comes, you're ready to step into what He has for you. And when that moment comes, it won't take years. It'll happen in a night. One divine appointment with God can change everything. So don't be discouraged by the years you feel you've lost. Don't let the weight of the waiting keep you from believing that God is still working on your behalf. One night with Him can redeem it all. He can turn things around faster than you could ever imagine. And He can do it in a way that will leave you in awe of His power and grace. God doesn't need a lifetime to move in your life. He just needs your trust, your faith, and your willingness to believe that He can do it in His perfect timing. So hold on to that truth tonight. God can redeem the last 10 years of pain, confusion, and waiting in one moment. And He is about to do it in your life. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. Because God is working, and tonight matters more than you can even understand. Delay is not denial. Tonight is divine timing. There's a misconception that if something is delayed, it means it will never happen. We've all been there, waiting on a promise, holding on to hope, and wondering why God hasn't come through yet. Sometimes, when we see no immediate results, we begin to think that God has forgotten us, that the promises He made are somehow no longer valid, or that He's denied us what we've prayed for. But the truth is, a delay doesn't mean denial. In fact, it's often a sign that God is preparing something far greater than we can imagine. Consider the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child when they were well past childbearing age. They received the promise, but years passed and nothing happened. 1 year passed, then 2, then 10. Sarah's body grew older, and the possibility of conceiving seemed to fade with each passing day. It was easy for them to question, to wonder if God had forgotten his promise. But the delay didn't mean denial. In fact, God was working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for the right time. When God finally fulfilled his promise, it wasn't just a simple child being born. It was Isaac, the child of promise, the one who would carry the covenant forward. The delay had purpose. The waiting had meaning. If God had given them Isaac in their own timing, they might have missed the fullness of the miracle. Instead, he allowed them to wait because he was setting up a divine moment that would display his power, his faithfulness, and his perfect timing. Sometimes we want things to happen on our timeline. We want our prayers answered right away. We want the breakthrough to come as soon as we ask for it. But God's timing is not like ours. His timing is perfect. And it is always in alignment with his will and his plan for our lives. Just because God doesn't answer your prayer immediately doesn't mean he isn't working on your behalf. It simply means that he is waiting for the right moment. The moment when everything aligns, when you're ready to receive what he has prepared for you, and when his glory will shine the brightest. Think about the Israelites. God promised them the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. They were slaves in Egypt, oppressed and broken, crying out for freedom. When God finally heard their cries and delivered them, they thought their journey to the promised land would be swift. But instead of leading them directly to the land, God took them through the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years of wondering why the promise wasn't coming faster, why they were still stuck in the desert. It would have been easy for them to give up. It would have been easy to lose faith and believe that God had forgotten his promise. But the delay wasn't denial. The delay was a season of preparation. God needed to refine them, to teach them how to trust him, and to mold them into a people who were ready to step into the promise. He was teaching them to depend on him completely, to walk by faith and not by sight, and to recognize that his ways are higher than our ways. During their time in the wilderness, the Israelites learned lessons that they could not have learned in an instant. God gave them manna to eat, provided water from a rock, and led them with a cloud by day and fire by night. He was with them every step of the way, teaching them to trust him even when the journey didn't make sense. The delay wasn't punishment, it was preparation. And when the time was finally right, God led them into the promised land. When you're in a season of delay, it can feel like God has forgotten you. It can feel like your dreams are slipping away or that your prayers are falling on deaf ears. But remember this, a delay is not a denial. God is still at work in your life, even when you don't see the evidence of it. The breakthrough you're waiting for is still coming, but sometimes it takes time for everything to align according to God's perfect plan. Jesus too experienced delays in his ministry. He had a friend named Lazarus who was very sick. Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, sent word to Jesus, asking him to come and heal their brother. But Jesus didn't immediately go to them. In fact, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. By the time he arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had died and had been in the tomb for 4 days. Mary and Martha were devastated. They believed that if Jesus had come sooner, their brother would have lived. They didn't understand why he had waited. But Jesus had a bigger plan in mind. His delay was not a denial of their request. It was an opportunity for God's glory to be revealed in a way they could never have imagined. When Jesus arrived, he called Lazarus out of the tomb, and Lazarus was resurrected. The delay made the miracle even more powerful. If Jesus had healed Lazarus when he was merely sick, the people would have praised him for healing. But by raising him from the dead, Jesus demonstrated his power over life and death. And many people believed in him because of it. So when God delays an answer to your prayer or takes you through a season of waiting, don't think it's a denial. He's setting the stage for something greater. He's aligning circumstances, preparing your heart, and positioning you for a breakthrough that will be far more powerful and far more impactful than you can imagine. Trust that God's timing is perfect. He knows exactly when to move and how to move. The delay is not the end of the story. It's simply part of the process. He is not slow in keeping his promises. He is patient and he is waiting for the right moment to act. His delay is always in line with his divine plan for your life. And when he moves, it will be worth the wait. So tonight, if you're in a season of waiting, don't lose heart. God's timing is not your timing, but it is always perfect. He has not forgotten you. He has not denied you, and he is still at work in your life. Keep trusting, keep praying, and keep believing that his promises will come to pass. Because the delay is not a denial, it's divine timing. God saves his strongest moves for the darkest hours. There's a powerful truth embedded in the heart of Scripture. God's greatest works often emerge in the darkest moments of our lives. When everything around us seems to be falling apart, when we can't see the way forward, that's when God often reveals his might in ways we couldn't have imagined. The Bible is full of stories where God saved his most powerful moves for the darkest hours. It's in those moments that his glory shines brightest and his power becomes most. Take, for instance, the story of Moses and the Israelites. For years, they were in bondage in Egypt, slaves to a Pharaoh who had no regard for their well-being. They cried out to God for deliverance, but it seemed like nothing was happening. The more they prayed, the worse things got. The Pharaoh increased their labor, making their lives even more miserable. But in the midst of their suffering, God was quietly preparing his greatest move. When God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, it was in the darkest of times. The Israelites had reached their breaking point. They had been oppressed for so long that they began to wonder if God had forgotten them. But that was the moment God chose to reveal his plan. He sent Moses to confront Pharaoh. And through a series of miraculous signs and wonders, God demonstrated his power in ways no one had ever seen. The plagues that struck Egypt were a direct result of God's timing, and each one brought Israel one step closer to freedom. And then when they were at the Red Sea, trapped between the waters and Pharaoh's army, it seemed like there was no hope. The Israelites were surrounded and they thought their situation was impossible. But it was in that moment of complete despair that God performed one of his greatest miracles. He parted the Red Sea, allowing his people to walk through on dry ground. And then he closed the waters over their enemies, defeating Pharaoh's army once and for all. That moment at the Red Sea was a defining moment for Israel. It was in the darkest hour of their oppression that God demonstrated his greatest power. They were backed into a corner with no way out, and that was exactly when God chose to show up in a big way. God saves his strongest moves for the darkest hours. But this theme is not limited to the Old Testament. We see it in the life of Jesus as well. In the darkest hour of human history, when it seemed like all hope was lost, God worked his greatest miracle. When Jesus was crucified, the world believed that evil had won. It was the darkest moment of all time. The Son of God, the Savior of the world, hanging on a cross, dying a humiliating and painful death. And his disciples were scattered, full of fear and confusion, and the hopes they had placed in him seemed shattered. But in that very moment, when all appeared to be lost, God was working his greatest move. The crucifixion was not the end. It was the beginning of something far greater. On the third day, Jesus rose from the dead, conquering sin and death and providing a way for humanity to be reconciled to God. What seemed like the ultimate defeat was in reality the ultimate victory. Jesus' death and resurrection brought about the greatest transformation the world has ever known. The darkest hour of all time became the moment of salvation for all people. God saves his strongest moves for the darkest hours. Think about the Apostle Paul. He was once a persecutor of Christians, hunting them down and having them thrown into prison. But one day, on the road to Damascus, Paul had an encounter with Jesus that would forever change his life. He was struck blind, and for 3 days he could not see. It was in the darkness of those 3 days that Paul's life was transformed. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, regained his sight, and became one of the most powerful advocates for the gospel the world has ever known. Paul's greatest ministry came after his darkest moment. His entire life was changed in that time of blindness, and from that moment on, he went on to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, establishing churches and spreading the good news of Jesus Christ across the world. He suffered many trials, imprisonment, and hardship. But in those dark moments, God's power was evident. Paul's letters, filled with encouragement and wisdom, continue to impact believers today. It's easy to question God in our darkest hours. It's easy to wonder where he is when everything seems to be falling apart. But the Bible is clear. God is never closer to us than when we are at our lowest. He doesn't abandon us when we're struggling. In fact, he's right there, preparing to do something powerful in our lives. The darkest hour often precedes the greatest move of God. It's in our weakest moments that his strength is made perfect. When we come to the end of ourselves, when we've tried everything we can and still see no way out, that's when God is ready to step in and show us his power. It's in the dark valleys that he leads us to green pastures. And it's in the storms that he reveals himself as our refuge and strength. God's timing is always perfect. He allows us to go through seasons of darkness because he knows that it is in those times that we are most open to his work in our lives. He doesn't promise to take away the darkness, but he promises to walk with us through it. And when the time is right, when we are ready, he will bring us out of that darkness and into his marvelous light. Whatever darkness you may be facing right now, whether it's a personal struggle, a financial challenge, a relationship breakdown, or a crisis of faith, know this: God is at work. He is saving his strongest move for this moment. What seems like the end is only the beginning of something greater. The darkness you're walking through is the perfect backdrop for God's glory to shine through. He is about to move in ways you never imagined. Trust that even in the darkest hours, God is with you and he is preparing to do something powerful in your life. Just as he parted the Red Sea, just as he raised Jesus from the dead, just as he transformed Paul's life, he is ready to move in your life in a way that will bring him glory and bring you victory. Do not be discouraged by the darkness. The night is not the end. It is the beginning of a new chapter. God is preparing something greater than you can imagine. And when he moves, his power will be evident to all. Hold on. because God saves his strongest moves for the darkest hours. Your obedience tonight activates a new beginning. Obedience to God is not just a one-time decision. It's a continual choice to align our hearts with his will. It's easy to obey when everything is going well, when life is calm and the path seems clear. But the true test of obedience comes when we are faced with a decision that requires us to step out in faith, to follow God even when we don't understand the full picture. It is in those moments that our obedience has the power to activate something new in our lives, something that will change the course of our journey. Throughout Scripture, we see how obedience unlocks God's blessings and sets his plan into motion. In the book of Genesis, when God told Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a land that he would show him, Abraham didn't have the full details. He didn't know where he was going or how long the journey would take. All he knew was that God had spoken, and obedience meant trusting God with the unknown. Despite the fear, the uncertainty, and the discomfort of leaving everything behind, Abraham obeyed. And because of his obedience, Abraham became the father of a great nation. God didn't just bless him with land and descendants. He made an everlasting covenant with Abraham. Abraham's obedience activated the beginning of a new legacy, one that would impact generations to come. The same principle applies to us today. Obedience is the key to unlocking God's promises. It doesn't always make sense in the moment, but obedience is an act of faith that aligns us with God's greater purpose. Think about Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses was hesitant. He didn't feel qualified. He didn't feel equipped for such a monumental task. But God's call to Moses wasn't about Moses' ability. It was about God's power. When Moses obeyed God, even though he felt inadequate, he stepped into a new chapter of his life. His obedience to God's command led to one of the greatest deliverances in the history of the world, the parting of the Red Sea and the liberation of God's people from slavery. Moses' obedience didn't just affect his own life, it impacted an entire nation. It brought freedom to millions of people who had been in bondage for centuries. His obedience activated a new beginning for the Israelites, a new era of freedom and possibility. The same is true for us today. Our obedience can change not just our lives, but the lives of those around us. When we say yes to God, when we step out in obedience, we become a vessel for his power to move in ways we can't always see or understand. There's also the story of Esther, a woman who was thrust into a position of influence for such a time as this. Esther's obedience came at a critical moment when the Jewish people were facing annihilation. She had to make a bold decision, one that required great courage and faith. She could have stayed silent, but her obedience to God's calling led her to approach the king, risking her life in order to save her people. Her obedience activated a new beginning for the Jewish people, turning the tide of their fate from destruction to deliverance. Esther's story reminds us that our obedience isn't just about us. It's about the impact we can have on the world around us. Sometimes the call to obey God comes at moments of great risk when we don't know what the outcome will be. But when we choose to obey, we partner with God in bringing about his will. Our obedience is a key that unlocks doors that were once closed, and it creates pathways for God's plan to unfold in ways we couldn't have imagined. In the New Testament, we see how obedience to Jesus' call brought about radical transformation in the lives of his disciples. When Jesus called Peter to leave his fishing business and follow him, Peter didn't know where the journey would lead. He didn't understand all that Jesus had in mind, but he obeyed. And because of his obedience, Peter became the rock upon which Jesus built his church. His life, once focused on fishing for fish, was now centered on fishing for men. Peter's obedience activated a new beginning for his life and for the kingdom of God. Jesus is still calling us to obedience today. He calls us to leave behind our comfort zones, to step into the unknown, and to trust him with the next step. But it's not always easy. The call to obedience often requires sacrifice, letting go of our plans, our desires, and our control. It can be scary to surrender to God's will when we don't know what the future holds. But just like Peter, when we obey, we step into a new beginning. We enter into a life filled with purpose, meaning, and eternal significance. Obedience to God is also the key to our own spiritual growth. When we obey, we grow in faith and trust in God's character. We learn to rely on his strength rather than our own. Obedience doesn't just change our circumstances, it changes us. It shapes us into the people God has called us to be. Every act of obedience is a step forward in our journey of becoming more like Christ. When God calls us to obey, it's not always about understanding all the details. It's about trusting that he knows what's best. It's about following his lead even when we can't see the whole picture. When we step out in obedience, we activate God's power in our lives. We allow his will to be done, and that opens the door for new beginnings. Tonight, God may be calling you to take that step of obedience. Maybe it's in a relationship, a job, a ministry, or a personal decision. Whatever it is, I encourage you to listen to his voice and obey. Don't wait for all the answers or for the perfect circumstances. Step out in faith, knowing that your obedience is activating a new beginning. It's not just a beginning for you. It's a beginning for all that God wants to do in and through you. God's promises are tied to our obedience. When we obey, we align ourselves with his plan. We create space for his blessings to flow. Obedience is not a burden. It's an invitation to partner with God in his work on the earth. It's a chance to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, something eternal. As you step out in obedience, trust that God will meet you in that step. He will provide, he will guide, and he will equip you for whatever he has called you to do. Your obedience is not in vain. It is a powerful act of faith that unlocks the doors to the future God has for you. As you obey tonight, know that you are activating a new beginning, one that will lead to greater purpose, greater joy, and greater glory for God. God's purpose for your life is greater than your current circumstances. When we find ourselves in challenging or difficult situations, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. We get so caught up in our immediate struggles, whether it's a health issue, a financial setback, or a relationship breakdown, that we forget that God has a plan for us that goes far beyond our present reality. In moments of hardship, we may question God's purpose for our lives. We may wonder why things aren't going the way we expected. But in those very moments, we must remind ourselves that God's purpose for us is greater than our current circumstances. One of the most powerful reminders of this truth is found in the story of Joseph. As a young man, Joseph was favored by his father, Jacob, and that made his brothers jealous in their anger. They sold him into slavery and he was taken to Egypt. Joseph's circumstances seemed hopeless. He went from being the beloved son of a wealthy family to a slave in a foreign land. But even in the midst of this trial, Joseph remained faithful to God, and he trusted that God had a purpose for him. Joseph's journey was far from easy. He was wrongfully accused of a crime and thrown into prison, but even there, God was with him, and Joseph continued to trust in God's plan. Over time, Joseph's circumstances began to shift. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and was eventually elevated to a position of great power in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Joseph's story is a powerful testament to the truth that God's purpose for our lives is not limited by our current circumstances. It began as a life filled with betrayal and hardship, ended with Joseph saving his family and an entire nation from famine. In the same way, God's purpose for us is not dictated by the challenges we face today. We may find ourselves in seasons of waiting, pain, or struggle, but God is always at work, orchestrating his plan for our lives. We can trust that he has a purpose for us, even when we can't see how things will work out. God doesn't waste our pain. He uses it for his glory. Just as he used Joseph's hardship to bring about a greater good, he can use our struggles to bring about his purpose in our lives. The Apostle Paul is another example of someone whose circumstances did not define God's purpose for him. Before his conversion, Paul was a persecutor of Christians, actively working to destroy the early church. But when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, everything changed. Paul's life was radically transformed, and he went on to become one of the greatest missionaries in history. He wrote letters that make up a significant portion of the New Testament, and his ministry brought the gospel to countless people across the Roman Empire. Despite his many accomplishments, Paul's life was not without difficulty. He faced imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks, and constant opposition. Yet through it all, Paul never lost sight of the fact that God had a purpose for his life. In his letter to the Romans, Paul writes, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Romans 8:28. Paul understood that God's purpose was greater than any trial or tribulation he faced. He knew that God was using his circumstances to further his kingdom, and he was willing to endure whatever it took to fulfill that purpose. When we find ourselves facing difficult circumstances, it's important to remember that God is working all things together for our good. We may not understand why we're going through certain struggles, but we can trust that God's purpose for us is always good. In the book of Jeremiah, God promises, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." To give you a plan for the future and a hope. This verse reminds us that God's plan for our lives is always for our benefit, even when we're going through difficult times. God is still working behind the scenes to bring his purpose to fruition. Our circumstances may change, but God's purpose for our lives never changes. He has the plan for each of us, and that plan is not dependent on our current situation. In fact, sometimes God uses our circumstances to prepare us for the greater things he has in store. Just as Joseph was prepared for leadership through his time in slavery and prison, God often uses our trials to shape us and refine us for the work he has called us to do. The Bible tells us that God uses all things to mold us into the image of his Son, Romans 8:29. The difficult seasons of our lives are not wasted. They are part of the process of becoming who God created us to be. There may be times when we feel discouraged or overwhelmed by our circumstances. It can be easy to lose hope when things aren't going the way we expect. But in those moments, we must remind ourselves that God's purpose is greater than our current reality. We don't have to have all the answers or understand how things will work out. What we do need is faith. Faith that God is at work in our lives, even when we can't see the full picture. In the book of Hebrews, we read that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1. Faith means trusting that God is working, even when we don't see the results right away. We can trust that his purpose for us will come to pass regardless of what our circumstances may look like in the moment. If you're going through a season of struggle, remember that God is with you. His purpose for your life is greater than your present situation. He is using this season to prepare you for something greater, something that will bring glory to his name, just as he was with Joseph, with Paul, and with countless other believers throughout history. He is with you now. Trust in his plan, trust in his timing, and trust that he is working all things together for your good. Even when life doesn't make sense, even when things seem uncertain, know that God is at work in your life. His purpose for you is far greater than you can imagine, and he will bring you through this season stronger and more equipped for the future he has prepared for you. Hold on to his promises and remember that no matter what you're facing, God's purpose for your life will always be greater than your current circumstances. God is always positioning you for greater favor. God is in the business of positioning his people for greatness. It might not always be the way we expect, and sometimes it involves navigating through difficult seasons. But one thing is for sure, God is always working behind the scenes to prepare us for the greater favor he has in store. We often look at our current situations, whether it's our job, our relationships, or our health, and think that we're stuck, that we've reached a dead end. But God is never limited by our present circumstances. He's constantly at work, positioning us for favor that will elevate us to the places he's called us to. One of the most powerful examples of God positioning someone for favor is the story of Esther. As a young Jewish woman, she was taken from her home and placed in the royal palace as part of a beauty contest to choose the new queen. Esther didn't ask for this. She didn't know why she was there, but God had a plan. He was positioning her for something far greater than she could have ever imagined. At the time, the Jewish people were facing the threat of annihilation. The king's advisor, Haman, had convinced the king to issue a decree that would lead to the extermination of all Jews. Esther, as queen, had access to the king, but approaching him uninvited was punishable by death. Yet, through divine positioning, Esther found herself in the exact place at the exact time to change the fate of her people. God used her position, the very one she hadn't sought, to bring about a deliverance for the Jewish nation. Esther's obedience to God's call to act was the key to her positioning for favor. In our own lives, it's easy to look at where we are and question why we're in a particular place or situation. We might feel overlooked, undervalued, or like we're in a holding pattern. But God is positioning us for something greater. He sees what we cannot see. He knows what we don't know. And just like Esther, God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating the right circumstances, people, and timing to position us for favor. The story of Joseph is another powerful example of God's positioning for favor. Joseph's life was marked by extreme highs and lows. He went from being his father's favorite son to being betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery. He ended up in Egypt, working as a servant in Potiphar's house. But even in this lowly position, God was with him, and everything he did prospered. Despite being falsely accused and thrown into prison, Joseph's character remained intact, and his ability to interpret dreams was noticed by Pharaoh's cupbearer. In one moment, Joseph went from being a prisoner to being second in command over all of Egypt. God had been positioning him the entire time. His time in prison was not wasted. His time in Potiphar's house was not wasted. Everything Joseph went through was part of God's plan to elevate him and position him for favor that would not only save his family, but an entire nation. Joseph understood that the favor he experienced was not a result of his own efforts, but the result of God's divine positioning. We must learn to trust that even when things don't make sense, God is positioning us for favor. It's easy to get discouraged when we don't see the fruit of our labor immediately. We might question why we're not advancing in our careers or why we're facing obstacles in our personal lives. But God's favor doesn't always show up in the way we expect. It's often behind the scenes, working through the people and situations that seem insignificant in the moment. The favor of God is not about our ability to control outcomes, but about our willingness to trust in His timing and His plan. Another example of God positioning someone for greater favor is found in the life of David. As a young shepherd, David was overlooked by everyone, including his own family. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel, David wasn't even invited to the ceremony. He was out in the fields tending sheep. But God had been positioning David for favor all along. David didn't know that his time was coming, but when the moment arrived, God sent Samuel to anoint him as king. David's journey from a humble shepherd to a king was not instantaneous. He spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, and facing countless challenges. But in each of those moments, God was positioning him for favor. The experiences he had while on the run from Saul shaped his character and prepared him for the throne. David's favor didn't come because of his strength or ability, but because God was with him and had been positioning him for a greater purpose. In our own lives, we may feel overlooked or like we're not moving forward. But just as God positioned David in the right place at the right time, He is positioning us for greater favor. We don't always understand the process, but we can trust that God is at work. Every season we go through, every relationship we build, and every challenge we face is part of God's plan to position us for the favor He has for us. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul experienced God's favor in incredible ways, but it didn't come without difficulty. Paul was a man who endured shipwrecks, imprisonments, beatings, and much more. Yet through it all, God's favor rested on him, and he became one of the greatest evangelists the world has ever known. Paul understood that God's favor was not just about personal blessing, but about fulfilling the greater purpose of spreading the gospel. Paul was positioned to impact the world in ways that no one else could, and he trusted God's plan, even when it involved suffering. We must remember that favor isn't always about wealth, status, or comfort. It's about God positioning us to fulfill His purpose. Favor may come in the form of an opportunity, a relationship, or a moment of divine intervention. But regardless of how it shows up, favor is God's hand at work, moving us closer to the destiny He has for us. If you find yourself in a season where it feels like you're stuck or overlooked, take heart. God is positioning you for favor. He's working behind the scenes, and the things that may seem insignificant or frustrating right now are part of the process. Just as He did for Esther, Joseph, David, and Paul, God is positioning you for greatness. His favor will show up at the right time, in the right way, and when you least expect it. Trust His timing and trust that He is preparing you for something greater.